welcome to Good Reasons to Believe. I'm Alan Darley. The title of today's show is Pragmatic Arguments for a Skeptical Age. And I'm delighted to have as our special guest today Daniel Vecchio. And I know that you're going to be inspired by hearing Daniel today. He has a brilliant mind and a strong faith in God. Daniel is a PhD student at the Marquette University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He's taught courses in the philosophy of religion. He runs his own blog dedicated to apologetics. And I first came across Daniel on another discussion forum called Unbelievable, which is run by the Premier Christian Radio. And Daniel immediately impressed me on that forum, not only with the quality of his arguments, but also by his generous attitude to those he was debating with. Daniel originally comes from Concord, Massachusetts, but he lives at the moment in Milwaukee, Wisconsin with his wife, where they're members of St. Peter's and Paul Parish. Daniel, welcome, and thank you for coming on today's show.
Hi, Alan. Thanks for having me.
Daniel, can I begin by asking you to tell us something about your story, how you came to faith, and what role you think philosophy has had in that journey?
Okay, well, I was raised Catholic, so I never really had a big moment in my adult life of conversion experience. But around when I was in the third grade, my mother sort of came into the charismatic movement of the Catholic Church. And that, for me, because of my mother's sort of newfound or invigorated faith in the charismatic movement, she kind of inspired me and to continue to explore my own faith, and she was always a sort of support for me on that. So I would say that was sort of the big movement for me in the third grade. And then when I got to high school, I started encountering doubts. I had friends, very intelligent friends, who didn't believe, and I always wondered, well, why should I believe? There are very smart people that don't. And I had, family as well who lacked belief in God. And so that sort of drove me into really starting to study philosophy, to try to come up with reasons for why I actually do believe in God and to see if there are good reasons to believe. So
it's more of a strengthening role. Philosophy wasn't something that brought you to faith, but it's something that has strengthened your walk with God and dealing with doubts. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I wouldn't say I've ever been an agnostic or atheist or anything like that, but I certainly have struggled with my own doubts, and it was actually quite a shock the first time I took a philosophy course as an undergraduate and discovered that there were arguments for God's existence.
Yeah.
Whether or not they're successful is another question, but I had no idea that people reasoned about faith. So it was quite a shock for me.
Well, that's something I'd like to return to a little bit later, if we may. I notice you live in Milwaukee. For those watching in the UK, they may not know where that is. I guess that's in the United States, yes?
That's right. It's in the Midwest, about 90 minutes north of Chicago. In Wisconsin, home of beer and cheese.
Okay. Have you tasted some of the local ale?
Can you recommend
have
it? I occasionally. Not this morning, though, so don't worry.
Okay, well, it might calm the nerves a little bit. And can you tell us what it is that you're studying for your PhD? Right,
so I actually started the PhD program interested in the philosophy of religion, but so I wanted to explore the arguments for God's existence, but I soon found that the field is actually quite narrow and very specialized, and so I thought in terms of my own interests, also in ancient philosophy, that I would explore Aristotle and some of the issues surrounding essentialism and also his modal logic. So I'm actually more geared right now towards ancient philosophy, sort of working on my Greek and exploring those areas of ancient logic. So that's what I'm doing right now. But I maintain a strong interest in the philosophy of religion.
Now, that's not something you're going to be speaking about directly today, is it? The essentialism and Aristotle?
No. Yeah, I'm not going to be talking about Aristotle's modal syllogistic, which is an interesting topic on its own, but it's not really. I think there might be some relationship to it in the philosophy of religion that I'd like to explore later in my career, but not today.
Yeah, personally, I'm quite glad about that because you've lost me already on that particular topic. So can you tell us what it is actually that you want to speak to us about today?
Well, I want to talk about the issue of skepticism and how the pragmatic arguments for belief in God are a good response to them. So I sort of want to explore it, especially because I think, in fact, when we talk or engage with atheists or agnostics, you find that it's not so much these arguments against God's existence, like the problem of evil or the problem of divine hiddenness that they'll cite, but oftentimes they just say that they have a lack of belief in God. And so, and that's due to a sort of skeptical attitude towards the evidence.
Yeah, this is something I've come across more and more, this new definition of atheism, of not a positive belief that there's no God, but just a lack of faith in God's.
Yeah.
Is that what
That's
you're
right.
talking about?
I think it has its origins actually in the works of Anthony Flew, a prominent philosopher who passed on recently, but he was a prominent atheist and wrote essays like The Presumption of Atheism. Of course, it was quite famously he came to a sort of deistic position towards the end of his life.
Yeah.
But he maintained. But his articles were very influential and remain influential in sort of the atheistic community, especially the new atheism. So.
Yeah. In spite of the fact that he followed the argument where it led, as he said, out of that.
That's right, and actually, yeah, somewhat controversially, I guess once he made that conversion, a lot of atheists came out and attacked his intellectual abilities and his mental faculties. So it was quite sad, I think. But.
Yeah. So are you saying that skepticism should not be the default position?
Well, it's not necessarily that it's not the default position. I guess it's a complicated issue, the issue of skepticism, because I think it is a virtue, an intellectual virtue. But what I want to say is that universal skepticism, or the sort of principled skepticism, isn't something that can be maintained. And I think that it can be shown that it can't be maintained. So that's where I'm arguing from. So a lot of these sort of lack of belief atheists often hold this position. They'll tell you that they don't have a burden of proof. That is, they don't have to give a justification for why they lack a belief in God. And that's, of course, I think, true. To lack a belief in something, I don't have to give you a justification for why I lack a belief. But what I think does carry a burden of proof, that what does need to be justified, is when the atheist makes the claim that one should lack a belief in God, that's the proper position to take. And I'm not sure that itself has a justification. In fact, I don't think it's justified. So that's sort of the position I'm taking here. So
you don't think that skepticism in itself is a bad thing?
No, it's not a bad thing. In fact, I think it's integral to being a person of faith. I mean, you look at C.S. Lewis or Dostoevsky, or even going back to St. Paul, or any of the early church fathers like Augustine. There's always a sense in which skepticism is part of that faith journey. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's important.
So your only difference would be that You don't think that skepticism is a totality, that
Right.
it's leading towards something.
Yeah. So, you often hear some new atheists or sort of prominent internet atheists will repeat the sort of Carl Sagan slogan, extraordinary evidence, or that extraordinary beliefs require extraordinary evidence, something like that, or extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And that itself is a claim, and it requires, I think, a justification. It has its roots that go all the way back to David Hume, who said that a wise man should proportion his belief to the evidence. And then later on, I think in the 19th century, W.K. Clifford wrote that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for everyone to believe anything for which there is insufficient reason. So this is sort of a belief that has had many manifestations throughout the history of skepticism.
Mm. And in speaking to you earlier, you said that you thought that this kind of vicious skepticism, as you called it, is self-defeating. Could you tell us what you mean by that?
Well, to put it this way, so if we look at that creed or that statement that we need extraordinary evidence or sufficient evidence, I ask if the skeptic has accepted that, and sort of put them in this dilemma. Have they accepted that belief without sufficient evidence, or did that belief, did they sort of require that they have sufficient evidence even to accept that creed? And if you think about it, if on the one hand they didn't have sufficient evidence for accepting that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, then their skepticism is not universal and it admits of exceptions. And on the other hand, if they admit that they don't have sufficient evidence, or that they have had sufficient evidence for it, I don't think that's true, because first of all, as a universal claim, they would really have to have all the data. And I don't think that they do. And secondly, I think there are clear instances of beliefs we hold that we think are rational that we don't have sufficient evidence for. And philosophers often bring up examples like belief in the external world, which, of course, if you think about it, why would I doubt the existence of the external world? Well, it's not that we should doubt it. I think we shouldn't doubt it. But that if we look at the evidence we have, we're interpreting it already as evidence of the external world, but it might not be. So take our senses.
So even the total skeptics have assumed certain things that perhaps are not aware of, some kind of fun thoughts or presuppositions.
I think the only consistent skeptic would have to say that they lack basically that they lack knowledge altogether. And then even that's a difficult question, because you can put to them the question, well, do you know that you lack knowledge? And of course, they'd have to deny that. And really, the skeptic ends up being in a position where they really can't say anything at all. To even open your mouth is to begin to make a claim. And so it really becomes this problem of avoiding justification. And I think at the end of the day, we do have certain beliefs that we can stand on, even if we can't fully justify them from an evidential standpoint.
Yeah. So certain fundamental beliefs are rational, even though we can't necessarily prove them.
That's right. So, the principle of non-contradiction, if you want to deny it, you certainly can, but then it's very difficult to engage rationally with such a person. If you want to deny that there are other minds in the world or that there's an external world, you can do that. But at the end of the day, I think the the bigger question is, would you really want to call people who don't share that belief irrational? Or, and I don't think that's
They're
a fair
the
assessment.
condition of they're almost a condition of the possibility of reason, aren't they? If they didn't exist, we couldn't have reason.
That's right. I think that they're basic positions we have to take just to get reason off the ground.
So how would you build on these facts then as part of your apologetic? Because you're talking about pragmatic arguments.
That's right. So there are different classes of arguments that apologists will give for belief in God. And the traditional ones that are commonly known are sort of the cosmological argument, and that has different varieties. The ontological argument, which is not often defended, but is, I think, a very interesting argument that some people do put forward.
It's had a bit of a revival, hasn't it, in recent years?
That's right. In the 70s, with the works of Norm Malcolm, Charles Hartshorne, and Alvin Plantinga, and then the ontological argument sort of has reemerged again. Robert Maydal is one of the prominent figures that sort of has put forward some other interesting versions, and so has Alexander Pruss. So I think there's some life left in that argument.
And what do you think has been neglected in that approach that you want to redress?
In terms of the pragmatic arguments?
In terms of the other arguments apart from the pragmatic?
Well, I think that they can serve as reasons to sort of believe in the existence of God. I do think that belief in God is a matter of reason and not one of faith. I think actually above and beyond the existence of God, then we get into matters of faith. And that's sort of actually a position that Thomas Aquinas held, that the existence of God is not a matter of faith, it's a matter of natural reason. But beyond that, the sort of attributes of God, or whether God is Trinitarian or whether the other sort of dogmas of a religion are true, become an issue of faith and revelation. So,
yeah, and I think we could also say that even when we've rationally come to demonstrate God's existence, we still have to put our trust in Him personally.
That's right.
In that relational way.
That's right. Yeah, I think in James it says that the demons believe God exists,
yeah.
but that's not sufficient. It's not salvific to just simply believe in God, at least on the Christian faith. So it's certainly faith as a trust, a certitude in that we have with regard to that we can trust God for our salvation. That's not something I think we can go out into the world and investigate. But I think we have to take certain things on faith. But the pragmatic argument... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So having proofs doesn't destroy faith. Like in the famous Hitchhiker's Guide parody with the Babel fish, they thought that if God's existence could be proved, then you no longer needed to believe in Him, and therefore He doesn't exist.
Right. That seems rather silly. I think that faith is not to be shouldn't be defined that narrowly. I think of faith as simply it's not just belief, but I think you're right with that idea that it's a trust. It's more than just I have an opinion, something like that.
Now you're quite inspired by Pascal. He's often dismissed by a lot of people today because of Pascal's wager. Could you tell us a bit about who Pascal was and why you think we shouldn't dismiss his argument?
Okay, so Pascal was a prominent mathematician and scientist of the 1600s, and he wrote a collection of sort of thoughts that he put together, the Pensées, and it has apologetic value, although most of it is actually focused on sort of historical questions about the scriptures. But he's probably most well known in terms of the Pensées for his wager, which you mentioned. And I think it's a bit misunderstood.
What is the wager for people who are unfamiliar?
Okay, so the wager goes something like this. He tells us that he's of the position that you can't really decide whether God exists or not based on arguments like the ones we mentioned, the cosmological or ontological arguments or fine-tuning types arguments. He doesn't think that will settle the question. But he thinks that it, more or less, whether or not we believe in God, it's sort of an open question. And he also says that we're in life, we have to make a decision whether we are going to believe or not. So we can't just walk away from the table. We have to place a bet, so to speak. We have to make a wager. And what he does is points out that we can consider whether or not basically he considers belief in God, whether we believe it in God, and whether or not God exists as two different things that we can consider at the same time and sort of cross them to consider possible outcomes in terms of whether or not the outcomes would be good or not for us, basically. And that's the sense in which it's a pragmatic argument. So he says, on the one hand, if we believe in God and God does exist, then he says that there's an opportunity for infinite goodness, an infinite good will be gained. And on the other hand, if we believe in God and God doesn't exist, then we might be disappointed, we might live according to a falsehood, and there would be a finite sort of harm associated with that. But on the whole, maybe you live a good life. He also considers if we don't believe in God and God exists, we could risk losing that infinite good, which would be devastating. And then, on the other hand, if we disbelieve in God rather, and God doesn't exist, then we have a bit of truth, which is a good, but it's finite, and that's about it. So he says, considering those four possibilities, he says a person would be reasonable to believe in God, considering the possible outcomes. This sort of infinite good that could be gained. It's worth the wager.
Yeah. Now this has been dismissed, hasn't it, by, for example, in the God Delusion, Richard Dawkins. He says, well, what kind of a God would expect you to make a gamble like that? Why would he think that's a virtuous activity rather than judging us on sincerity, for example?
Yeah, I think actually Richard Carrier makes a similar objection, and many others, that somehow this wager, God, if God exists, God would see through your motives and see that you're just placing a bet and that it's not a sincere belief. And if that were Pascal's claim, I think ultimately that would be devastating to him. But that's not really what Pascal's arguing. He's not arguing that the wager should form the basis of the belief. Rather, he's using the wager as a way to point out that a belief can be reasonable. And so he doesn't think that then we can just all of a sudden on the turn of a dime begin to believe in God. And in fact, gives sort of advice as to how you can come to believe. And actually, I think I have a quote here I thought would be relevant. Let me see if I can find it. Just give me a second. He writes this. So you go through the wager, and he says, I confess it, I admit it. but still there's no means of seeing the faces of the cards. Yes, Scripture and the rest, etc. Yes, but I have many hands tied and my mouth closed. I am forced to wager and am not free. I am not released, and am so made that I cannot believe. What then would you have me do? So this is the question. I can't believe even though I have the wager down. Should I have an insincere belief? He says, true, but at least learn your inability to believe, since reasoning brings you to this, and yet you cannot believe. Endeavor then to convince yourself, not by increase of proofs of God, but by the abatement of your passions. You would like to attain faith and do not know the way. You would like to cure yourself of unbelief and ask the remedy for it. Learn of those who have been bound like you, and who now stake all their possessions. These are people who know the way which you would follow, and who are cured of an ill of which you would be cured. Follow way by which they began, by acting as if they believed, taking the holy water, having masses said, etc. Even this will naturally make you believe and deaden your acuteness. So for Pascal, belief is not simply a matter of reason, but also a matter of the emotions, of the passions. And the wager might be an intellectual shift for you. It might remove obstacles for why you haven't believed. But it's not going to alone make you believe. So he thinks you need to get your passions behind that. And that's a separate process by which you can then come into sincere belief.
I see a parallel there with Marxism in a way. Marxists often talk about raising consciousness, and that when someone, say, gets involved in a protest, they begin to see the truth of socialism. So it's not just an intellectual thing, but something emotional that comes through action.
That's right. I think we do have to surround ourselves with, people who have that passion, and it is infectious. And you might say, well, why would I want to do that if I don't believe? Maybe I don't want to believe. Well, if the wager has led you to the conclusion that belief is reasonable, then why wouldn't you want to surround yourself around people who believe, so that you can sort of catch that passion, so you can have a sincere belief? I think that's important. Yeah. And I think it's borne out, as you said, the sort of Marxists want to employ similar methods. And I think we even see now the rise of the atheist church in the UK, the sense in which community is really important for keeping ourselves motivated and believing things that are important for us to believe.
Isn't the problem with that, though, that there's no way then of testing between conflicting communities? You've got the atheist community, the Marxist community, Christian community, a cult. They're all maybe perhaps following the same line of belonging before you believe. What is the criteria for objectively testing that truth?
Well, again, Pascal is talking about belief in God, which he doesn't think that there is definitive evidence one way or the other for. So with regard to, say, Marxism, I think that, well, that would be a separate question of whether or not political evidence is for the truths of Marxism, and whether, his materialistic dialectic is true. We can sort of test those, I think. But between the atheist church and, say, a Christian church, which should I belong to, I think goes back to that belief matrix. Is it reasonable pragmatically for me to disbelieve in God? I think we can go back to that.
Now, William James comes along with a variation on that argument, doesn't he? How is it different?
Right. So William James, he's a prominent figure in psychology, actually, but he's also a great philosopher of the late 19th, early 20th century. and associated with the school of thought called pragmatism. But the way he cashes it out, you can tell that he certainly was inspired by Pascal. But he talks about he's addressing specifically Clifford's point that it's wrong always, everywhere, for anyone to believe something on insufficient evidence. And so he wants to say, well, there might be conditions, or there are conditions in which it is reasonable to form a belief. And he doesn't put it so much in a belief matrix or a decision grid like Pascal. Rather, he gives basically different categories and says when certain conditions are met, then it will be acceptable to believe. And so he says, first of all, the belief has to be a genuine one that's open. So again, just like Pascal, it can't be closed by reason. We can't have definitive proof that God does not exist and then continue to try to believe. If the proof is definitive, then we just have to follow that evidence. Secondly, and
so
he's not
just saying then. He's not just saying then that truth is defined by what works.
Well, that's a very difficult area, sort of the pragmatic definition of truth, and I think it's often misunderstood that somehow William James was a relativist, that he didn't affirm a correspondence theory of truth. What he did was he sort of brought together the correspondence theory of truth and the coherence theory of truth and tried to unify it. But in certain respects, he was making a point that if we think of truth as an agreement between what is said and reality, well, what do we mean by agreement? And that has to be unpacked. And what do we mean by reality? And that has to be unpacked. And so he sort of has this idea that what we say is often not exactly like reality, but approximates it. And so there's sort of degrees in which things can be true. And I think that's borne out in our experience. So what I say might not be precise, but it might be largely correct, and it might work in the context in which I'm employing it.
Okay.
So I don't know if that addresses that issue, but...
Yeah. So I interrupted what you were starting to say earlier. You got through one point.
Oh, yeah. So the other issues that so it has to be open. The evidence can't be decisive. Just like for Pascal, the issue of whether God exists is not decided by the evidence. Secondly, it has to be a living option. And by this, and this is, I think, very important because today, I think, especially for the new atheists, belief in God is becoming less and less of a living option. And by that, William James means that the belief in God, or any belief, not just belief in God, has to be relevant and believable today. So, for instance, I don't really consider belief in Odin or Thor as a living option for me. It's tied to a whole web of beliefs that I just don't hold. It would require a massive paradigm shift in my thinking for me to have Odin or Thor as living options for me to believe, but not so for Christianity. Now, the question is whether Christianity will remain a living option for atheists, and that's where issues of, how can faith integrate with scientific worldview, with evolution, with the age of the earth, with biblical inerrancy. I think those all become very important issues when you're presenting the Christian worldview to an atheist, because if they see, I'm tied to my evolution, so Christianity, if that means no evolution, then it's no longer a living option. So that's an important issue. A third one.
So, as you think, part of the job of an apologist then is to remove some barriers to people seeing Christianity as a live option?
That's right. If Christianity is to be presented as a live option for someone who stands outside of the Christian worldview, then I think what C.S. Lewis calls a mere Christianity has to be presented, not some very particularized presentation of Christianity where all sorts of dogmas are defined down to the letter, so that if you're going to buy into Christianity, for instance, I'm a Catholic, you'd have to buy into the perpetual virginity of Mary. Well, that might be very difficult for someone who stands, not just for someone who stands in the naturalistic sort of worldview, but even within Christianity, that's hard to accept. So there's a lot of arguments that would have to be made, and it burdens a Christian overly to say, well, I have to present reasons to be a young earth creationist or to believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary before you're going to come to belief in Christ as your Lord and Savior, and to believe in God even. So
yeah.
In terms
of
an
a struggle in the early church too, wasn't it? In the early church, there were people who were saying, well, you need to become culturally a Jew in order to also be a Christian, and then that was a barrier to Gentiles.
That's right, and issues
of whether stripping things down to the core.
Right. Whether you need to be circumcised or not, those sorts of issues. Right.
Yeah.
I think of.
Now, sorry, we're running out of time a little bit, so I wondered before we see if the live audience have got any questions to answer. I want to zoom in on the effect of this in your life, really, because William James. I've got a quote here from William James's book. He says, God is real because he produces real effects. This is his claim. But what real effects would you point to as evidence of God in your life, or perhaps in lives of people you know?
I mentioned my mother and her move towards the charismatic movement. A little bit later in my life, when I got to high school, I struggled with anxiety and depression, and it was really in turning to God and surrendering my life to God that helped me to move past those anxieties and fears and to seek a sort of healing in my life. I've seen that sort of movement in many people's lives. And with my mother, too, she's been involved in healing and deliverance ministries and has seen God move in many people's lives. And I do see God healing people and helping them. Now, in terms of an apologetic approach, I know that were I to stand in the naturalistic position of an agnostic or atheist, that those aren't very moving. Maybe I had some sort of placebo effect of believing in God and whatnot. But from within my worldview, I do sense God in my life. So.
And I think there is something very attractive about that as a way of presenting an apologetic. Yesterday I watched Les Miserables on the film at the pictures, and just that remarkable story of the power of forgiveness in someone's life.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's part of the Christian story, and
to see the face of God in another, yeah.
Well, we've got quite a few questions coming in. I hope we have time to deal with at least some of these. So a viewer's commented, do you believe there are any claims that do not require any evidence to accept? If
yes,
so, what are they?
Well, I don't think that I have evidence for, say, the existence of the external world. I think that one could be, say, an idealist and think that that all my sense perceptions are mental and do not correspond with an external reality. That's a philosophical position one can take, but I don't think it's irrational to therefore be agnostic about the existence of the external world. Likewise, Russell put forward the thesis that one could believe that the world popped into existence 5 minutes ago with the appearance of age and with my memories intact of a long past. Sure, that's a possibility. I don't think that, therefore, I have to be skeptical of whether there was a history or a past to this world. I don't accept that. I think that we can simply accept that there was the common sense view. And as we mentioned earlier, logical laws, a lot of those are taken as axiomatic. We don't have to prove the principle of non-contradiction. That stands at the foundation of any proof, so we need it for proof.
Yeah. Okay, I'll move on quickly. Another comment: if there are claims, as you say, which shouldn't require a great deal of evidence to accept, then why can't the claim about extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence be one such claim which should not require a great deal of evidence to accept?
Well, then I think, if it's taken as a universal, and that's why I said that skepticism isn't necessarily a bad thing. What I'm saying is, if it's taken as a universal, that this is my foundation of what that determines what I believe and what I won't believe, then I think that's incoherent. If you say, well, I tend to, in certain circumstances, I tend to want sufficient evidence before I form that belief, I think that's fine and it's acceptable. And what I was doing with William James is laying out those conditions, and what he said is, if it's a living, forced, and momentous situation, then you can certainly have the option to believe it. But not everything's forced on us. We can take a step back, and often in science, we can take a step back and wait and evaluate the evidence and then make a decision. And that's when I think a skeptical approach is warranted, and that's when I would apply such a principle. The question is whether God is a context in which that principle should be applied. And I don't think that there are overwhelming arguments for that.
Thank you. If belief in God is a matter of reason and not faith, says another viewer, do you believe that extraordinary evidence of his existence is available to us? And if so, then why should we not require such evidence?
Right. So my position is that there is sufficient evidence for God's existence. I'm not really sure what Sagan has in mind by extraordinary. That's kind of a fuzzy term. But I do think there's sufficient evidence. And I think you can look at the Leibnizian cosmological argument as a good example. I think Alexander Pruss has given an update on that, and it's very compelling. I think that certain modal ontological arguments are very persuasive, at least in my estimation, but might not compel other people. The reason I think we need to also have pragmatic arguments is precisely because should all these arguments fail me, should the evidence start to turn the other way, and suddenly I find myself in a position where I say there isn't good evidence out there for God's existence, or should, rather than saying turn the other way, if I just find out that there really isn't any good evidence to believe, then I think the pragmatic arguments are still open options.
And also, people might not have access to those arguments, might they? They might not have. They might not be academic. They might not have studied those or come across those sophisticated Leibnizian arguments.
Absolutely.
And would that disenfranchise some people from faith if they required that argument?
Right. Belief in, like I said, I think the natural light of reason can reveal God's existence, but as Aquinas thought and as Aristotle thought, these metaphysical speculations take a lot of time and study. In fact, they didn't think anyone should do metaphysics until you're much older in life, much older than I am. So maybe I'm being a bit presumptuous. I think you have to be 50 before you start to engage in such speculation. So, according to them.
A final question here. Somebody's asked: Is subjective evidence valid?
I think it's subjective evidence is compelling, and I think would warrant personal belief in God. But I think it's a mistake to assume that it should have the same force on someone else. So when I say I've had personal experience of God in my life, it would be a mistake for me to assume that that should have any force of persuasion on anyone else. It might persuade some people, but whether it ought to is another question, and I'm not sure that it should. I think it can serve to reinforce people who are already within my worldview, within my position of being a believer in God and a Christian.
Well, we've got about 4 minutes left. Could you sum up what the argument that you've been trying to put to us today?
So the argument that I'm putting forward is that belief in God, because it's something that I don't think is settled, at least definitively, for atheism or for agnosticism, I think it's at the very least an open question. Now, I think it's that reason tends towards belief in God, but I think it's a modest position to say that it's an open question, and I think that it's also one that we have to place our bet on, we have to consider, and that it's not going to be something that is a small matter. It's choosing whether to believe in God or to go without belief in God does have major ramifications for one's worldview. And the question is whether or not you would agree that the potential for this infinite good, this gain, outweighs the possibility of being wrong. And I just want to read one quick quote if I do. Do I have time?
Yeah.
To end on that? All right, yeah. So yeah. Let me get this here if I have it. Maybe I don't have it with me, but I'll just summarize it then really quickly. The idea that James has is that there are really two different imperatives that we have in life. One is to pursue truth, and the other is to avoid error. And we really have to strike a balance between the two. They're not the same thing. And if we live our life always trying to avoid error, then the best position would just be a skeptic. And that way we would never believe anything that's false. But I think in a certain way, we also have an imperative to believe the truth, and that might require at times taking a risk. I took a risk when I believed that my wife would be a good person to marry. I didn't have all the evidence in. I didn't have extraordinary evidence, but it certainly has been life-changing. I took the risk, and I take the risk to believe in God, even if the arguments might fail me. You know, if the ontological or cosmological arguments might fail me, I still take that risk. It's a risk to have a relationship that I think is of infinite worth.
Thank you, Daniel. It's been brilliant. I feel like my brain's had a workout today, and I'll need to watch this show over and over again to just take in many of those points. But that's just been a fantastic interview. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for having me.